Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries is back with Volume 2, and it's just as fascinating as the first part. One of the cases featured was the death of JoAnn Romain, who police believed committed suicide, though many people, including her family, believe that she might have been murdered. Let's investigate. If you generally enjoy mysteries, true crime, disappearances, and the occasional conspiracy, please feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. On the 12th of January 2010, 55-year-old JoAnn Matouk Romain disappeared after attending a prayer service at a Catholic church along Lake St. Clair, Michigan. Her car was found abandoned in the church's car park, and she had left her handbag, purse, and cash in the car. Despite police searching the area, divers searching in the nearby lake, no sign of JoAnn was found until 70 days later, 30 miles away, when her body was found floating in the Detroit River. At the time, and ever since, police believe that JoAnn committed suicide, although her family believe otherwise, and it's hard not to agree with them considering some of the suspicious details surrounding JoAnn's death. According to Grosse Pointe News, Grosse Pointe Farms police declared JoAnn dead of a suicide within minutes of arriving at the scene, which is absolutely bizarre. I mean, sure, I imagine when police arrive at a scene, they're going to have a first impression of what might have happened, but this just seems like tunnel vision. There's no way her death could have been given the investigation it deserved if it was instantly just assumed as suicide. Why would they just assume she killed herself without even considering foul play or even an accident? Police theorise that JoAnn had left her car in the car park, walked in some snow in her high-heeled boots, crossed some rocks, and then made her way down 2 seawalls where she entered the lake. They claimed that impressions in the snow showed that someone had sat down on the first break wall, then pushed off to get down to the second wall, and then sat by the lake. After entering the lake, JoAnn would have had to wade through water for around 400 yards to get to where the water would have been deep enough for her to drown. Aside from the story itself not sounding too plausible, there are quite a few details which make it sound even less likely. For example, there were no signs at all that anyone entered the lake. There was no holes in the ice at all, and I don't think it was completely iced over, but there was just no signs at all to indicate that anyone had actually entered the lake. There were footprints in the snow leading to the water. Despite police claiming these were JoAnn's, others have said they did not match JoAnn's shoes, instead they were closer to a large athletic or business attire shoe. These footprints were not measured, and the photos taken by police were not the standard they should have been. They were taken from the wrong angle for a start. I mean, looking at the photos, you can't even fully make out footprints. Clearly someone moved through the snow, but I don't think these photos show that that must have been JoAnn. The police did not have a footprint expert analyse the footprints or the photos. JoAnn's daughter believes it was strange that when her mother's body was found that her coat was zipped all the way up. This wasn't like her, she didn't normally zip her coats up at all, so why when she was found dead would her coat be zipped all the way up? JoAnn was apparently scared of the dark and scared of water, so it just seems like a very unlikely way that she'd want to kill herself if she would at all. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that she didn't, because people can act strange and different to the norm in situations like that, but it is just another point that makes it seem less likely. The Netflix episode showed a woman attempting to walk down to where JoAnn would have had to walk to enter the water, wearing similar shoes to what JoAnn was wearing that night, and it seemed almost impossible without help. Given how difficult it looked to walk down there with those heels on, I don't understand why she wouldn't have just taken them off. I mean, if she was genuinely just set on killing herself, why wouldn't she just take her shoes off to walk into the water? According to Detroit Free Press, there was no current that could have pushed JoAnn's body 30 miles. The article also makes some other interesting points. JoAnn had no history of mental illness or suicidal tendencies, and she filled up her car with gas on the way to the church, which makes it sound kind of unlikely that she planned to kill herself. I think these are probably the weakest pieces of evidence though, just because someone's actions prior to doing something like that are often hard to understand, and just because her family or doctors weren't aware of her being depressed doesn't mean that she wasn't. Though the same article also states that Michelle said that her mother was becoming increasingly paranoid in the months prior to her death. She believed someone unknown was following her, that her phone was tapped, and that people were entering her home. She even changed the locks. This discrepancy is interesting because if it's correct, it sounds like JoAnn's mental health was declining. Does it definitively mean she killed herself? No, but it does detract from the narrative that it would be completely out of character for her. This point was also mentioned in the Netflix documentary. The article then goes on to mention that the cause of death was dry drowning, which is extremely rare. I did wonder for a moment if dry drowning was more common in cold water, and according to Google it is, so this point could be argued either way. It could support the police's theory because she entered the ice water, so would be more likely to dry drown, or it could suggest that she had some kind of altercation prior to entering the water that compromised her ability to breathe. It's worth noting that the initial Canadian autopsy showed no signs of foul play. In fact, the manner of the death was undetermined. The final point mentions that she had bruises on her upper arm, the same arm that she carried her handbag, and that the bag that she carried that night was torn. The bruises could have been something else, could be a red herring, but it does sound suspicious and possibly suggests a struggle. Grosse Pointe News notes that a crime scene expert hired by the family stated that her body was in surprisingly good condition considering it had been moved by the current for 30 miles. He said that it would be very unlikely for there not to be more damage to the body and damage to the clothes as well if she really had moved 30 miles by the current. If the body really travelled that far, it makes sense that it would have been brushing off rocks and bouncing against them, so it does seem pretty unlikely that there weren't more marks and signs of damage to the body and the clothes. Michelle, along with two of her siblings, filed a federal lawsuit against investigators who maintained that JoAnn's death was a suicide, though the lawsuit was eventually dismissed. Detroit Free Press lists some more clues suggesting against the suicide theory and highlighting police incompetence. As already mentioned, police never measured, moulded or casted the footprints at the scene. They claim this was because they were focused on finding a missing person who they believed was in the water. A witness from the church heard JoAnn's panic alarm on her car go off for about 10 seconds. I'm not sure if they approached her car to investigate or what happened with that. JoAnn's handbag was never tested for fingerprint or DNA evidence. Her boots had no scuff marks despite the fact that she would have had to walk down a steep embankment and over rocks in order to drown herself in the lake. A forensic expert said that he found it was almost inconceivable that she drowned herself and that there's a potential that she was just dumped in the water. Another interesting detail is that according to a witness who left the church at around 7:30, when they left, the driveway at the church was empty. They did not see JoAnn's car. So where was she at this time? And why would she leave the church, drive away, then drive back to park in roughly but not quite the same spot, and then go and kill herself? That just doesn't make sense to me at all. And even if some of the points mentioned here don't necessarily mean that she was murdered, I do think it's enough to warrant a proper investigation being conducted and not just for a death to be passed off as suicide within minutes of the police arriving at the scene. Paul Hawke, a potential witness who surprisingly wasn't mentioned in the Netflix show, stated that he was driving past the church that night and noticed a woman matching JoAnn's description sitting on the wall near the lake and two cars parked illegally nearby. Two men were standing close to the woman, and he said that he worried about the woman because it looked like she was slumped over. According to CBS Detroit, as Mr. Hawke slowed down and approached the men, he observed the first two of the vehicles, which was a dark blue or black four-door sedan, which appeared to be a municipal vehicle. Thinking it could be a police vehicle there to assist the woman, Mr. Hawke looked at the license plate to see if there was an X in the middle, and there was not, and he made a written note of the first three characters of the license plate, which were the letters BHP. One of the men reached into his inner coat pocket as if he were going to pull something out, then quickly pulled his hand back out and stuck his other hand into his outer coat pocket, and he motioned for Mr. Hawke to drive through. Mr. Hawke believed that based on the way that the man was motioning to him, that the man was trying to imply that he had a gun in his coat pocket. After hearing about JoAnn's disappearance and her description, he believed that she was the woman that he saw that night. Despite Paul likely witnessing a crucial part of that night's events, he spoke with police officers for around 40 minutes, but then he was told to go home, write down his statement, and then bring it back to the police department the next day. I don't know if that's just standard practice in America, but to me that seems really strange that they'd tell him to go home and write down his own statement. I mean, shouldn't the police officer take the statement for him? For 2 years, he heard absolutely nothing back from the police, until 2012, shortly after he had discussed what he had seen that night with an FBI agent. A Grosse Pointe Woods detective contacted him to ask him about what he'd said to the FBI agent. Paul claimed that the detective became very aggressive with him when he claimed that he could positively identify the two men that he had seen that night if he saw them again or photos of them. Apparently the detective even threatened to charge Paul with obstructing an investigation, which is just absolutely crazy. I mean, he was a witness to a potential crime and he's just simply stating what he saw and he's getting threatened with a charge. It just seems very, very suspicious. And up until now you might have wondered if the police were just extremely incompetent, but there are some details that suggest that the police might have actually intentionally tried to cover something up. JoAnn's daughter Michelle claims that on the night her mother went missing, she was visited by a police officer at around 9:25 to 9:30 p.m, who informed her of the disappearance. Though according to the police, they only found JoAnn's car at 9:55 p.m, so how on earth could they have known she was missing 25 to 30 minutes before they found her car? Now, it's not impossible that Michelle could have been mistaken on the time. It seems likely that something like that would stick in your mind, but she could have got it wrong. Though Coast Guard records show that the Coast Guard received a call requesting a search for JoAnn Romain at 9:30 p.m, the same time Michelle claims she was visited by an officer. Police ran a check to determine the owner of the car at 9:58 p.m, so how did the Coast Guard receive a call for requesting a search for someone and the name of that person before the police even knew that anyone was missing and even who it was that was supposed to be missing? What's more strange though is that the car was insured under Michelle's name, so how and why did the police think that JoAnn was missing rather than Michelle? A 3-day search of the water was performed looking for JoAnn, though no sign of her was found, despite the fact that she was wearing dark clothing and the water was very clear, so it just seems very likely that they would have seen her if she was in that water. It was very shallow water and there was practically no current whatsoever, so it seems very unlikely that a body could have moved in such a short period of time. So I think we've seen enough evidence to at least question the official findings. It seems increasingly likely that JoAnn might have actually been a victim of foul play, but who could have been involved? Some believe it could have been her cousin, Tim Matouk, who, what a surprise, is a former Harper Woods police officer and now works as an investigator with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. Paul, the witness who thinks he saw JoAnn by the lake that night, claims that he is positive that one of the men he saw stood nearby was Tim. Both JoAnn's daughters, Michelle and Kelly, claim that one day in the weeks prior to her disappearance, she received a call from Tim, which led to an argument, and after she turned white and hung up, she told them that if anything happens to her or if she goes missing, that Tim should be investigated. Obviously this is alarming in itself, though it's even stranger considering that the daughters believe that this was the first time that Tim and JoAnn had spoken in at least 10 years. So what happened for Tim to just randomly call her then in such a seemingly threatening manner? Michelle and Kelly weren't the only people to mention Tim as a possible suspect. Police took a witness statement from a retired FBI agent and a friend of JoAnn's who suggested that they look into Tim as a possible suspect. As for a motive, a family feud had been ongoing ever since JoAnn's parents had died. Her mother died in 1994, 6 years after her father. To cut a long story short, her parents had made quite the fortune selling rare wines and had left millions of dollars in their will to be split equally amongst their 5 children. However, JoAnn and her brother John never received their fair share of the estate and accused their brother Bill and sister Rosemary of stealing millions. After settling for $600,000 each in back payment, John went on to start a successful business. However, the business failed and he blamed Bill and his cousin Tim for his misfortune, claiming they told lies, pulled strings, and turned people against him. JoAnn and Bill did not speak for a couple of years until shortly before JoAnn's death when she called Bill and said that she wanted to talk about their cousin Tim. She drove to meet him on the 30th of December 2009. It's unclear what was said, but apparently JoAnn had made it clear that she didn't like Tim and was even scared of him. Of course, this also means that Bill is a possible suspect too, just because he had a motive if he and JoAnn had fallen out over the inheritance money. Though considering the case was settled in court and it sounds like JoAnn and John were worse off, if anything you'd think that they'd be the ones that had motive to harm him, not the other way around. I couldn't find any information to suggest that JoAnn or John pursued the matter after the court case. There was probably bad feeling at least, but I don't think they actually took further action. Not saying Bill shouldn't be investigated, but at least in my opinion he doesn't seem as suspicious as Tim. I've seen some articles point out that this would be quite a weak motive, and considering the feud was ongoing for years and years before JoAnn died, why would Tim suddenly decide to kill her now? Though it's impossible to know exactly what was going on or what was said between the two prior to JoAnn's disappearance, it wouldn't be the first time a family feud has got way out of hand and people have been killed for a lot less in the past. It's hard to know if Tim's possible motive would be directly related to the inheritance feud or not, but it sounds like whatever Bill and JoAnn spoke about that day was pretty important considering that they hadn't spoken for around 2 years prior to that. It's also interesting that the conversation took place in person rather than on the phone. I wonder if there was a reason for this. Maybe it related to JoAnn believing that a phone was tapped. Although we don't know the exact contents of that discussion, we do know that it was about Tim, and it doesn't seem unlikely that the conversation could have got back to him and that it might have angered or worried him in some way, depending on what it was. I mentioned earlier that Michelle said that JoAnn claimed that she was being followed prior to her disappearance and that she believed that a phone was being tapped. Now, it absolutely could be a sign of paranoia and could suggest that her mental health was deteriorating, but what if someone actually was following her? And what if that person might have been Tim? Being a police officer, he would know how to intimidate someone without leaving evidence. I mean, it wouldn't even be hard to just follow someone without leaving any evidence. As for JoAnn believing that a phone might have been tapped, it's impossible to know considering that a phone has never been recovered. Why wasn't it in the car with the rest of her belongings, or at least zipped up in her coat pocket with her car keys? It is interesting that her phone appears to be the only item of hers that still hasn't been found. It's impossible to know if someone really was following JoAnn, but we do know that her family and doctors were never aware of any mental illness or suicidal tendencies, so guess how police came to be under the impression that JoAnn was paranoid, depressed and suicidal? Surprise, surprise, apparently Tim submitted that tip. And that's extremely suspicious in my opinion. How would he even know the state of her mental health, considering he barely even knew her at the time of her death? Of course, Tim's colleagues have stood by him and do not believe that he was involved in JoAnn's disappearance. Tim himself has pointed out that he was not directly involved in the investigation and does not know anyone personally who was. But I don't think that completely rules him out as a suspect, and I don't think it definitively proves that no cover-up occurred. Now, I'm not saying that he's guilty, he may well not be, but I do think that he should be considered a suspect and should at least be investigated further. I've seen JoAnn's estranged husband, David, mentioned in a few sources. The two separated 5 years before her disappearance, and she was preparing to divorce him a month before she disappeared. They apparently didn't get on well, and David was angry at JoAnn before she disappeared. He agreed to take a polygraph test. The results are unknown. It is known, however, that he refused to meet with a private investigator to answer questions about JoAnn. He is now married to JoAnn's best friend, who he started dating shortly after JoAnn's body was found. Beyond that, I couldn't find any information on David or anything to suggest he could be a possible suspect. A couple of sources I read suggested that he may have aided in the cover-up, but I couldn't find any evidence to support this. Michelle listed her top 3 suspects in the Netflix show, with the first being David and the second being JoAnn's brother John. From what I gathered, I don't think she actually believes that John murdered JoAnn or anything, but that her death might have been as a result of something John was mixed up in. As we already know, John once had a successful business, though it sounds like over the years he may have been involved in some shady activity, or at least with some shady individuals. Because John and JoAnn were so close, it's possible that someone might have tried to threaten or hurt John by harming his sister. Maybe they didn't even intend to kill her, just to scare her, and it went wrong. Considering John blamed Tim for his business not working out and may well have been involved with Tim in other ways that we aren't aware of, and the fact that something happened between Tim and JoAnn shortly before her disappearance, I still think Tim is left as the most likely suspect, from the information that is publicly available at least. I'm really surprised that Unsolved Mysteries didn't focus in more on Tim as a suspect. I mean, they even left some crucial information out, such as the witness who claims that he saw Tim with possibly JoAnn that night. Incidentally, this case is quite similar to the case of Robin Abrams that I covered last week. Both were somehow involved with police officers shortly before the disappearances. In both cases, witnesses could place the police officer with the victims shortly before they disappeared, yet it seems that both cases were never properly investigated and instead just instantly passed off as voluntary disappearances. Now obviously I don't believe that all police officers are bad. I think that some are genuinely just good people trying to protect people and do the job, but obviously there are some really bad ones that give the rest a bad name too. And it's just a really terrifying thought that if you were to get on the wrong side of a police officer, that the very people that are meant to protect you and to investigate your death if it was suspicious could actually be the ones trying to harm you and trying to cover it up. I started researching and writing notes for this case prior to the Unsolved Mysteries episode airing, so since watching I've gone back and added in details. I went into this with an open mind, but the more evidence I've seen, the less I believe that she committed suicide. I just think that foul play seems way more likely and there's way too many suspicious things that can't be explained. Assuming she did meet with foul play, it's impossible to say whether the police were just extremely incompetent or actively tried to cover it up, but it really doesn't look great for them given the evidence. And if they did try to cover up a possible murder, I really hope it's only a matter of time until they're all brought to justice. I mean, JoAnn's family will never be able to grieve in peace until they know for sure what happened to her. Despite the belief that JoAnn's death was due to suicide, technically the case remains open, so if you have any information on the death of JoAnn Romain, please head to unsolved.com. So what do you think happened to JoAnn? Do you believe the official story that she committed suicide, or do you think that she might have met with foul play? And if so, do you think Tim's a likely suspect, or do you have any other suspects in mind? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.